There is a man lying face down in a Norwegian snowfield at 3 in the morning, and the temperature around him is dropping past 40 degrees below zero. He has been there for 4 hours. He will be there for 4 more. He cannot light a fire. He cannot radio for help. He cannot move. He is 200 miles inside the Arctic Circle, 60 miles from the Russian border, and he is exactly where the British government needs him to be. Had you ever heard about this before today? What is happening in the fjords of northern Norway right now is not a training exercise in any ordinary sense of the word. It is not a diplomatic gesture or a proud military tradition maintained for reasons of institutional nostalgia. It is the reason the Cold War never went hot in the north. It is the reason Russia's nuclear submarines are contained. It is NATO's most important mission, conducted every single winter for more than 50 years by one of the smallest elite forces on Earth. And almost nobody talks about it. Tell me in the comments before this video, did you know the Royal Marines were stationed in Norway? Because by the end of what you are about to watch, you will understand why the answer to that question matters more than almost anything else happening in the world right now. To understand why British commandos have been lying face down in Norwegian snow since 1971, you first have to understand a map. Not a political map with its confident lines and colored territories, but a geographical one that tells you the shape of the problem before anyone has decided what the answer should be. Look at Norway on that map. It is a thin country, impossibly elongated, pressed against the top of the world like a finger pointing north. Its border with Russia in the far northeast has existed since 1949 as the only direct land boundary between a NATO state and the Soviet Union, and it is less than 100 miles long. On a global map, it looks trivial. In strategic terms, it is the most consequential stretch of land in the Northern Hemisphere. On the Russian side of that border sits the Kola Peninsula. By the 1960s, the Kola Peninsula was the most heavily militarized piece of real estate on Earth. The Soviet Northern Fleet was based there, concentrated in and around the port city of Murmansk, and its expansion through the late 1950s and early 1960s was transforming the alliance's calculations in ways that kept planners awake at night. The numbers were staggering. 171 submarines, hundreds of surface combatants, more than 400 combat aircraft, 16 separate military airfields, 2 full motorized rifle divisions maintained at constant readiness, with one of them positioned so close to the Norwegian border that its advanced scouts could have been across it in an afternoon. The Soviet Union was not building this arsenal purely out of aggression. It was building it out of fear. Concentrated on the Kola Peninsula were the nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines that formed the core of the Soviet second strike capability. These were the weapons that would still be able to retaliate after a NATO first strike had destroyed every land-based Russian missile. Those submarines and the survival of the nuclear deterrent they represented depended on one thing: the ability to exit the Arctic and reach patrol positions in the North Atlantic without being destroyed in transit. Their exit route ran through waters adjacent to northern Norway. Whoever controlled northern Norway controlled whether those submarines lived or died. And whoever controlled whether those submarines lived or died controlled the most dangerous negotiation in human history. This is the geometry that makes Norway not a small Scandinavian country at the edge of NATO's concern, but the cork in a bottle whose contents, if released without control, end Western civilization. It is the geometry that produced in October of 1965 one of the most remarkable documents in the history of the Western Alliance. The NATO Military Committee sat down to study what would actually happen if the Soviet forces on the Kola Peninsula moved into Norway's northernmost province of Finnmark. The study was classified. It remained classified for decades. When it finally emerged from the NATO archives in Brussels, what it said was so blunt, so unhedged by the diplomatic language, that usually softens institutional admissions of failure, that it reads today like a confession extracted under duress. The document concluded in plain language that the present forces stationed in Norway cannot prevent, by use of military means, the Soviet forces stationed in the Kola Peninsula from seizing Finnmark. Read that again. NATO's own generals had looked at the map, counted the divisions, measured the distances, and decided the door could not be held. The question then became not whether Norway could defend itself, but who would stand in front of a door everyone agreed was designed to break. The answer would come from an institution that had last stood in Norwegian waters 24 years earlier, in the darkness before dawn, on the 4th of March, 1941. Britain's connection to Norway does not begin with Cold War strategic calculation. It runs through blood spilled in those waters before the word NATO had been invented. In the last hours before first light on that March morning, 500 British commandos came out of the North Sea and hit the Lofoten Islands. This was a Norwegian archipelago of impossible beauty that had been producing fish oil for the German war machine since the occupation of April 1940. The operation was called Claymore. Its official objectives were industrial: destroy the fish oil factories, burn the glycerin stocks, sink the ships in harbor. The Lofotens produced half of Norway's total fish oil output, and fish oil was the source of the glycerin that went into German high explosives. Destroying it was a meaningful blow to Germany's capacity to wage war. The commandos achieved every objective and returned with 228 German prisoners and 314 Norwegian volunteers who would continue the fight from Britain. But buried within the records of what was seized that morning was something of far greater value than any of those figures suggested. The boarding parties that moved through the German ships in harbor came away with cipher materials and documents associated with the German Enigma encoding machine. The intelligence implications of what was taken in those frigid Norwegian waters would not be fully understood, let alone acknowledged, for another 30 years. The fish oil was the story that could be told in public. The Enigma was the story that won the war. 9 months later, on the 27th of December, 1941, British commandos returned. Operation Archery was larger, more complex, aimed at a better defended target. 570 commandos hit the port of Vagsø and the island of Maløy in Nordfjord, supported by the cruiser HMS Kenya and 4 destroyers with Royal Air Force fighters flying cover overhead. The planners had assessed the garrison at Vagsø as modest and manageable. They had not known that a unit of German mountain troops hardened by combat on the Eastern Front was in the town on leave when the British arrived. What followed was not a raid, but a battle. The commandos fought house to house through Vagsø's main street for hours, taking fire from soldiers who understood exactly what close quarters fighting in cold conditions required. 17 commandos were killed and 53 wounded before the withdrawal order came. The commander of the Norwegian Independent Company serving alongside the British was Captain Martin Linge, and he was shot and killed during the assault on the German headquarters. He became one of Norway's most celebrated resistance heroes. By any tactical measure, Vagsø was a costly success. By any strategic measure, it was something close to a masterstroke. When news of the raids reached Adolf Hitler, the Führer concluded that the British intended to invade Norway and use Scandinavian territory as a staging ground for operations against Germany's northern flank. His response was immediate. 30,000 additional troops were diverted to Norway almost at once. Then more arrived, and more. By the end of the war, in 1945, 600,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were garrisoned in Norway, fully equipped, properly supplied, and doing absolutely nothing. 600,000 men who never fired a shot on the Eastern Front, who were not at Stalingrad or Kursk or in the final defense of Berlin. Held in place for 4 years, by the credible threat that a few hundred British commandos, with the audacity to appear from the sea, might arrive at any moment. It was the first documented proof of a principle that would define British strategy in Norway for the next 8 decades. A small force consistently present, credibly capable, and embedded in Norwegian conditions is worth more than its numerical strength suggests. The Royal Marines did not forget this lesson. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, 3 Commando Brigade began sending detachments to Norway annually, learning the terrain, learning the cold, learning what the country demanded of men who wanted to operate in it, rather than merely survive it. In 1970-45, Commando Royal Marines formally took on the role of Britain's mountain and Arctic warfare specialists. The following winter of 1971 was the first full winter deployment. Every year since, without exception. What that commitment actually costs a human body is something the official descriptions of the cold weather warfare course tend to understate. The language of military press releases makes the course sound like a demanding camping trip. It is not a demanding camping trip. It is a systematic assault on every assumption a person carries about what the body can endure, conducted in an environment that kills without malice and without warning if a single component of the response fails. Arriving at Bardufoss Airport in January, the first thing that strikes is that the darkness is unlike any darkness encountered before. Britain has dark winter evenings. Northern Norway, 200 miles above the Arctic Circle, has something different entirely. A polar twilight that offers 4 to 6 hours of pale greenish light per day, during which the sun barely clears the horizon before retreating. The light is not enough to read by. It is not enough to navigate by without training. It is not enough to suggest warmth. Then there is the cold. Not the damp British cold that soaks through clothing and settles into bones. Norwegian Arctic cold is dry and penetrating, and at its worst, past 40 degrees below zero when wind chill is factored in. The kind of cold that kills exposed skin in minutes, the kind that turns diesel fuel to gel and makes the pulling of a trigger into a deliberate cognitive exercise that costs energy the body can barely spare. Every commando who deploys to Norway must first pass the cold weather warfare course known within the Corps as novices. The instruction is delivered by the Royal Marines Mountain Leader, Cadre, which is a permanently staffed body of Arctic and mountain warfare specialists who hold an 8-month qualification covering rock climbing, cold weather, survival, resistance to interrogation, snow and ice climbing, patrolling, and raiding. They are the hardest instructors the Corps produces, and they are capable of a specific kind of institutional precision that has nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with reality. As Color Sergeant Ian Freeman of 45 Commando has described it, without apparent hyperbole, the course represents the bare minimum skill set required to stay alive in a very aggressive environment. The opening week concerns the biology of not dying. It begins with lectures that no other military training program conducts anywhere in the world. The physics of heat loss through the human body in extreme cold. The chemistry of insulation. The mechanical progression of frostbite from mild discoloration to irreversible tissue death. Commandos learn to build snow shelters that are not comfortable but scientifically precise, because a correctly constructed snow hole maintains a temperature of exactly 0 degrees Celsius inside its walls, regardless of what the thermometer reads outside. At -40 Celsius in the surrounding air, the man inside a properly built snow hole is in a different climate entirely. They learn to navigate by stars, because in an environment where every surface looks identical and GPS systems are unreliable near the magnetic pole, the only fixed reference points are celestial. They learn that eating snow directly produces a dangerous drop in core body temperature that kills more slowly than exposure, but with equal certainty. Each evening is spent in 10-man tents, heated by a single fuel-powered lamp, with the men taking turns on the candle watch. 1 hour of sentry duty whose sole purpose is ensuring the lamp does not go out, because without it, the interior temperature drops to the ambient Arctic cold within minutes. Then, at the end of the first week, they face the ice. A hole has been cut in the surface of a frozen lake. The water below is black. The ice around the edges is 40 centimeters thick. One by one, the commandos step to the edge and drop in. The cold shock response that follows is involuntary and violent. The nervous system triggers an uncontrollable gasp reflex. Heart rate spikes dramatically. Muscles begin losing coordination within seconds. In the most extreme circumstances, cold shock can cause cardiac arrest before the swimmer has time to orient themselves. The drill simulates the consequence of breaking through ice during a winter operation, which is a genuine tactical risk in a country laced with frozen lakes and rivers that offer movement advantages to forces willing to cross them. The commando must drag himself out of the water using only his ski poles. Hands on the ice edge are not permitted. The poles must be planted on the ice surface, and the body levered upward through arm strength alone, in a body already losing fine motor coordination to the cold. But the most revealing element of the drill is not physical. While the commando is still in the water, still fighting the cold shock response, still working the poles against the ice, an instructor leans over the edge and asks him his name, his service number. He must answer correctly before he is permitted to leave the water. The cognitive test is the entire point. Cold degrades human brain function measurably and quickly. A soldier who cannot state his name and number under cold shock is a soldier whose judgment cannot be trusted in combat conditions involving cold water. The ice-breaking drill is the institution's method of identifying which commandos retain the mental architecture to function when the body is already failing. The ones who answer correctly shaking at the edge of a frozen Norwegian lake are the ones who will be trusted to operate in the dark, with weapons and radios, and the lives of their patrol, depending on their thinking. Mobility is the second week subject, and the distinction from survival matters. Survival is passive. It is about not being killed by the environment. Mobility is aggressive. It is the capacity to move through the environment with purpose and speed under a combat load. Telemark skiing is the primary mode of cross-country movement in Arctic Norwegian terrain, and it must be mastered under a 75-pound load with a weapon slung across the back and boots that veterans frankly describe as offering little to no flexibility. Every fall costs energy, and the Arctic energy is not a comfort commodity. It is a survival resource, and the mathematics are unforgiving. Each commando requires between 4,000 and 8,000 calories per day simply to maintain core temperature against sustained cold. Within each tent group, informal specialization emerges rapidly. The man who is efficient at converting snow to drinking water becomes the designated snow melter before anything else happens. Each morning, because hydration is the foundation on which movement cognition and combat effectiveness all depend. The third week introduces an enemy into the equation. Every tactical action that commandos have trained to perform in temperate environments must now be performed in extreme, cold underload, with reduced cognitive function across terrain that records their passage in ways temperate ground does not. Fresh snow holds tracks. Route selection becomes a tactical decision, not merely a navigational one, because prints visible from the air reveal patrol-size direction and load to any tracker with the training to read them. New standard operating procedures govern battlefield medicine, because casualty extraction in deep snow takes hours, where the same procedure in warm conditions takes minutes. The commandos learn to use the environment's hazards as weapons and to set concealed observation posts in terrain that an inexperienced force would only see as obstacle. The cost of inadequate equipment in this environment has been documented with the specificity of a legal proceeding. Stephen Howarth was a former Royal Marines officer who commanded a unit through a single training night in conditions of -21 degrees Celsius, still air with wind chill, pushing the effective temperature into the low -40s. By the time the night was over, 6 of his men were casualties. Cold weather injuries, frostbite. Every one of them had been wearing standard-issue British military kit. The men in civilian cold weather gear had no casualties at all. A formal board of inquiry convened. It exonerated Howarth entirely. His judgment and decision-making were found to be sound throughout the night in question. What the inquiry found wanting was the kit. The standard-issue equipment provided to Britain's Arctic committed force was inadequate for the conditions that force had been assigned to operate in. Howarth eventually left the Corps and co-founded a cold weather gear company whose technical foundations were built on precisely what the military kit had failed to provide. The board exonerated the man. It did not exonerate the institution. There was during the same period another military attempting to fulfill the same Arctic mission in the same Norwegian training areas. And their experience of what the environment demanded was so systematically different from the British experience that it has taken decades for the documentation to emerge in a form that could be published without embarrassment. In December of 1976, a bilateral study group of American and Norwegian military officers and diplomats began meeting to discuss the defense of Arctic Norway. In 1978, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown formalized the result. The United States Marine Corps was officially designated as America's contribution to the rapid reinforcement of Norway in the event of a Soviet attack. On paper, this was the world's most powerful military taking ownership of NATO's most vulnerable flank. In practice, the gap between American institutional confidence and Arctic operational reality would prove to be one of the most extensively documented failures in NATO exercise history. The first exercises were revelatory in the worst sense. During Arctic Express, 78–40% of the Marine Corps personnel who had completed pre-deployment training never actually deployed. They were transferred out court, marshaled injured, or otherwise unable to participate before the exercise began. To fill the gaps, 33 Marines who had received no Arctic warfare training whatsoever were drafted into the exercise force 2 weeks before deployment. These untrained men arrived in northern Norway, wearing Korean War-era cold weather clothing and carrying World War II surplus wooden skis and snowshoes. There was no dedicated cold weather training facility anywhere in the United States. The results were predictably what they were. The Royal Marines in the same exercises were conducting brigade-scale operations through Arctic terrain that was defeating American units at the battalion level. The British did not call for helicopters when the terrain exceeded their ski capability. They could ski. They had been doing so operationally under combat load for 15 years before the Americans arrived. When American commanders proposed using air mobility to compensate for the inability to move on skis, Major General Carl Mundy shut it down and documented his reasoning in the exercise after action report. In a real war, he wrote, enemy anti-aircraft missiles would destroy any helicopter attempting such a maneuver. The Marine Corps could no longer afford to use technology to mitigate inadequacy in over-the-snow mobility. It was past time, Mundy concluded, for the Corps to learn to fight like Norwegians. It was a remarkable thing for an American general to write. It was exactly correct. The Royal Marines had understood long before that the Arctic is not a problem to be solved with better equipment. It is a reality to be inhabited through accumulated knowledge, and accumulated knowledge takes time that no budget can compress. By the time of the exercise, Teamwork 84, the Marines were beginning to close the gap, deploying with Gore-Tex parkas and polypropylene base layers and specially cleated tracked vehicles. Almost all of those equipment developments had emerged directly from bilateral cold weather conferences that British officers had been pressing the American side to convene since the early 1980s. The Royal Marines had not just outperformed their allies in the Arctic, they had then been patient enough to teach them. That patience is the defining characteristic of the entire Norwegian mission. What the Royal Marines have been doing in Norway since 1971 is precisely the kind of strategic work that generates no dramatic headlines and produces no viral imagery. The mission runs in winter in darkness, in a country most British citizens would struggle to locate on a map, with confidence defending a flank whose logic requires a working knowledge of submarine warfare and nuclear deterrence theory to fully appreciate. It is by design invisible, and that invisibility is enforced not by secrecy, but by political necessity. Norway has maintained since the end of the Second World War that it will not host foreign military bases on its soil. The policy exists to avoid provoking Russia, which shares Norway's border monitors NATO military activity in the high north, with an attentiveness the alliance has learned not to dismiss and has never forgotten that Scandinavian territory was used as a staging ground for operations against the Soviet Union in 1941. Under this policy, the Royal Marines' annual winter training has been exactly that. Training. Not basing. Not forward deployment. Training. A distinction that both governments maintained for 50 years with the solemnity of a diplomatic arrangement both parties agreed never to examine too closely. In March of 2023, that arrangement was tested. The Royal Navy announced the establishment of Camp Viking, which was a British military operations hub located in the village of Øverbygd, 40 miles south of Tromsø, inside the Arctic Circle, approximately 225 miles from the Norwegian-Russian border. The announcement called it a military base. Norway's Ministry of Defense issued a correction within hours. Camp Viking, the Norwegian government emphasized, was not a new wholly British military base. It was a rebranding of an existing training facility within a Norwegian military installation. A facility with a 10-year lease, 1,500 troops, its own name. Described in Royal Marines documentation as strategically placed as a forward operating base to support NATO operations. What you call a thing is not always what the thing is. And what Camp Viking actually is represents Britain's permanent Arctic forward operating base for the first time in the country's post-war history. This is precisely what the deterrence mission requires, precisely what Russian intelligence has known it to be from the day it opened, and precisely what Norwegian domestic politics cannot officially acknowledge. The Lunna House Agreement of December 2025 formalized this at a higher level of commitment. Britain and Norway signed a defense cooperation agreement committing British forces to year-round operations in Norway rather than the previous pattern of annual winter deployments. A joint fleet of 13 Type 26 frigates, interchangeable between the two navies, would patrol the North Atlantic together. Investment in uncrewed mine-hunting systems, undersea warfare technology, and autonomous underwater vehicles would be shared. The 1,500 Royal Marines at Camp Viking would be there not seasonally, but permanently. Not a soul in any official statement from any government mentioned the Falklands, because the Falklands is where the Norwegian mission's invisible logic was first made visible, and made so visible it became Britain's most iconic military image, and almost nobody drew the connection at the time, or has since. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. The unit immediately recalled from wherever its members were spending. Easter leave was 45. Commando Royal Marines. These were the Corps' designated Arctic specialists, men who had spent every winter since 1971 in Norwegian snow, and they were ordered 8,000 miles south to a war in a different cold. The South Atlantic in May and June is wetter than Norway, its wind carrying the salt of open ocean rather than the dryness of polar air. The boggy, treeless terrain cut through with stone runs and peat bogs is different from Norwegian mountains. But the fundamental physical requirement is identical. carry a heavy load for a long distance in cold, deteriorating conditions without stopping. Think clearly when the body demands you stop. Fight at the end of it. The Chinook helicopters that were supposed to move 45 Commando forward from their beach landing at San Carlos on the 21st of May were destroyed when the container ship Atlantic Conveyor was struck by an air-launched Exocet missile on the 25th. The heavy-lift aircraft that would have ferried men and equipment across East Falkland went down with the ship. There was only one way forward. The commandos yomped. This is Royal Marine slang for a loaded long-distance march, and it entered the British national vocabulary in 1982, in a way nobody who was watching the news coverage ever forgot. 56 miles in 3 days, 36 kilograms per man. Across ground that a fit civilian completing a charity walk could not cover without support and recovery time. These men covered it in 3 days, under the weight of a small person in wind and rain and sleet and sub-zero temperatures toward a fight at the end of it. The Arctic training did not make the yomp comfortable. Nothing makes 56 miles in 3 days comfortable. What it made was possible. The Norwegian winters had built in these men a specific endurance template, the capacity to continue moving when the body insists on stopping, the judgment to manage energy expenditure across days rather than hours, the discipline to treat cold and exhaustion as conditions to be managed rather than emergencies to be escaped. On the night of the 11th and 12th of June, 1982-45, Commando attacked Argentine positions on Two Sisters Mountain in one of the final set-piece battles of the war. They won. Then they marched into Stanley. What the world remembers from that campaign is the photograph a journalist took of a Marine carrying a small Union Jack on his radio aerial, marching toward the Argentine capital. It became a statue unveiled by Margaret Thatcher at the Royal Marines Museum in Southsea in July of 1992. It became an emblem of British military competence and endurance that appeared in textbooks and on commemorative plates and in the memories of a generation. At no point in any coverage, any commemoration, or any anniversary feature did anyone note that the man in the photograph had spent his career preparing to fight in Norway. The Yomper was made in Norway, the most famous symbol of British military capability in the late 20th century, was the product of a NATO mission so obscure that the people celebrating it had never heard of it. That obscurity is increasingly untenable. The strategic arithmetic that produced the 1965 confession has not resolved. It has evolved. The Soviet Union is gone. Russia is not. 8 of Russia's 11 ballistic missile submarines are still based on the Kola Peninsula, carrying more than 600 nuclear warheads between them. That represents over 70% of what analysts assess as Russia's most survivable nuclear capability. They still need to exit through the Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap to reach their patrol areas in the North Atlantic. The GI-UK gap still exists as the choke point that determines who dominates the Atlantic in any future European war. And whoever controls northern Norway's airfields controls the air cover over that gap. The geometry is unchanged. What has shifted is the clarity with which it can now be seen. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine on the 24th of February, 2022, the effect on NATO's northern membership was immediate and profound. Finland applied for membership within weeks. Sweden, whose neutrality dated to the Napoleonic Wars, followed. By March of 2024, the Arctic was no longer a contested space between NATO states and armed neutrals on one side and Russia on the other. It was NATO on one side and Russia on the other. The buffer was gone. The strategic stakes that the Cold War had made clear and the post-Cold War optimism had obscured were clarified in a way that transformed the alliance's northern architecture within 2 years. Cold Response 2026 was the exercise that gave the moment a number. It ran from the 9th to the 20th of March across northern Norway and Finland simultaneously. 32,500 personnel from 14 allied nations. It was the largest NATO military exercise ever conducted in the high north, surpassing even the most ambitious exercises of the Cold War years, when the Soviet threat those exercises were designed to address was at its peak. The exercise was the first conducted under Arctic Sentry, which was a NATO vigilance program formally launched in February 2026 to provide dedicated permanent coordination for the defense of the Arctic. The scale of it was not a coincidence. It was a statement. The United Kingdom's contribution was 1,500 Royal Marines who had been at Camp Viking since January, working through a Norwegian winter that offered exactly the conditions the mission requires. Their most operationally significant moment during the exercise was not dramatic in the way artillery barrages are dramatic. It was quiet, precise, and technically demanding. A team of commandos from the Surveillance and Reconnaissance Squadron, the Shore Reconnaissance Troop, and 148 Commando Forward Observation Battery boarded the German Navy submarine U-35 in a Norwegian fjord 200 miles inside the Arctic Circle. U-35 is a Type 212. A diesel-electric submarine chosen because its small profile and exceptional acoustic quietness suit covert coastal operations that larger nuclear-powered boats cannot conduct. No British submarines were available. Fleet constraints that have become a recurring feature of modern British defense planning meant the mission required an Allied vessel. The commandos launched their inflatable raiding craft from the submerged submarine, using a procedure that demands physical precision, extremely difficult to maintain when water temperature approaches zero. They paddled ashore in darkness. They located a simulated enemy radar installation that was in the exercise scenario, blinding NATO's Naval Task Group to approaching threats. They observed its exact position, its power sources, and its defensive configuration. They transmitted targeting data. NATO surface combatants destroyed the installation. The task group's picture was restored. The commandos returned to the submarine and exfiltrated. Russia was watching. Not metaphorically, but literally. 2 Russian military aircraft flew surveillance routes over and around the exercise area on consecutive days. Norwegian Air Force F-35s scrambled to intercept both. The Norwegian military characterized the flights as routine and expected. That word, expected, carries more weight than it appears to. Expected by NATO planners because one of the purposes of cold response is precisely to be seen conducting it. 32,500 troops training across 2 countries are a message, and the Russian surveillance flights are acknowledgement that the message has been received. Britain's contribution to that message carried a constraint that no press release mentioned. 1,500 Royal Marines. No Royal Navy amphibious ships in support. The vessel available to support the exercise remained inactive in Gibraltar, throughout idled by a budget squeeze. Britain's most famous amphibious force conducted its most important annual exercise without a single British ship capable of putting them ashore from the sea. To execute the headline operation that NATO published globally, they borrowed a German submarine. What the mission has built over 53 consecutive winters is not reducible to any single exercise or any single capability. It is the thing that exists between the exercises. The accumulated, transferable, institutionally embedded knowledge that turns cold weather training from a checklist into a culture. The Mountain Leader. Training cadre's 8-month qualification. The cold weather warfare course revised and taught each year by men who have executed these procedures operationally, not theoretically. The specific understanding of Norwegian fjords, Norwegian weather patterns, and Norwegian terrain that cannot be learned from a manual and cannot be acquired without repeated physical presence in the country itself. This knowledge transfers outward. American Marines complete the cold weather warfare course under Royal Marines instruction. French Marines do it. Dutch Marines do it. Every allied nation that has sent forces to northern Norway has learned from British instructors the minimum standard the environment demands. Britain has been teaching the West to survive in the Arctic for half a century, in the same way it was teaching the Americans in those early dismal exercises in the late 1970s. Not as an act of superiority, but as the natural function of an institution that got there first and learned the lessons earliest. The inverse is also true. During the years when Afghanistan and Iraq absorbed the Royal Marines' commitment and resources through the 2010s veterans, describe the Arctic capability beginning to hollow from the inside. The standard that once required 3 winter deployments before a Marine could be considered an experienced Arctic operator was quietly set aside, replaced by a minimum competence qualification. The depth of cold weather knowledge across the Corps thinned in ways that took years to begin restoring after the Afghan commitment wound down. An institution built across 30 years can be hollowed out in 5. Filling it again takes longer than emptying it did. The Lunna House Agreement's most consequential provision is not the frigates, though the frigates matter. Its most consequential provision is the commitment to year-round operations in Norway, because continuous presence means the institutional clock never resets again. The knowledge the cold weather builds year after year in the bodies and judgment of commandos who return each winter to those fjords is the strategic resource that a 10-year lease at Camp Viking is designed to protect. You can procure ships on a schedule. You cannot procure 50 years of institutional memory. You can only keep it alive by refusing to let it stop. There is a man lying face down in a Norwegian snowfield at 3 in the morning. You know now what he is doing there. He is not maintaining a tradition. He is not fulfilling a bureaucratic NATO commitment or ticking an alliance obligation box. He is performing an act of deterrence, one of thousands of such acts accumulated across 53 unbroken winters that together constitute the British answer to a question NATO first asked in plain language in 1965 and has never fully stopped asking since. The question is simple. Who will stand in front of the door? Not because the door can certainly be held, but because the act of standing there visibly and continuously changes the calculation of those who might otherwise try it. The Royal Marines have been standing there since 1971, in the dark, in the cold, in the kind of silence that a snowfield at 40 degrees below zero produces, a silence so complete it seems impossible that anything important could be happening inside it. The most important things often happen in exactly that kind of silence. Now you know one of them.